Hey everyone, welcome back to Be Not Afraid. I'm Carrie Bartholomew, otherwise known as Carib Marcel, and I wanted to jump on today and have a guest that is going to continue the conversation on what is happening on our campuses. Yesterday, the Cougar Chronicle, lost you for a second. Yesterday, the Cougar Chronicle put out an expose on what is actually happening in our schools. And I know that I was able to interview someone a couple of weeks ago, and I think that he got a little lucky in terms of the things that he hasn't experienced, probably because the path that he took. The things we're going to talk about today are, in my opinion, somewhat disturbing. I have a reporter that I'm speaking to, and we're going to just jump into it. So, welcome, Kimball.
Thanks for having me on.
So, yeah, that interview was enlightening, and I have to say I wasn't really surprised by the things that it covered, but I was surprised that you were able to get access to it. So let's just talk about it. You are not. This was covering University of Utah. No, Utah Valley University. Sorry, this was covering Utah Valley University, and you are not a student there, correct?
That's correct. So my student newspaper, the Cougar Chronicle, we're based out of BYU Provo, and we usually cover issues related to our university, but it's only 10 minutes down the road from UVU. And when Charlie Kirk was assassinated last September, it brought a lot of the conservative students in the Valley together. And my paper, the Cougar Chronicle, is a conservative student newspaper. So Turning Point USA and pro-life clubs and us kind of have been coordinating lately. And because of this kind of rubbing shoulders more, we started to pick up on some of the things happening at UVU. So we got some of our investigative journalists from BYU to start poking into it, and that's how the story came together.
And I do want to get into that story, but the first thing that I find so shocking is that this is Utah, and the attack on conservatives seems very prevalent, especially with young conservatives. So, how many do you think are in your groups altogether? Would you say?
As far as conservative students,
Yes.
I would say conservative-leaning students are certainly the majority. There's at least a larger proportion of conservative students at these two schools than in the rest of the country. I would say there's probably 200 or 300 really active conservative students at both of these universities combined, participating in clubs, whether those are pro-life clubs or political college Republican clubs or Turning Point USA, that kind of make up the bulk of like the really active community.
Do you feel that there's a pressure to be closeted about conservatism?
Yeah, and this is the interesting thing about the two different schools, because they're two very different cultures. So I can speak for BYU's culture, where as a religious private school that leans very conservative in certain ways, but also has some of the academic influences in other ways. It kind of just depends on where you at, where you are, who your professors are, and what schools you're in within the university. I know from what UVU students have told me that at UVU, it's a lot more common for conservative students to feel like they need to closet their ideology and kind of protect their values and keep them close to their chest, which is unfortunate.
Well, and when we use the word ideology, a lot of people don't understand. I think another term is worldview. So you're supposed to closet your worldview, which is generally has been until I'd like to know when, a Judeo-Christian worldview. So when did that start to change?
From what I understand, the way that academia has been taken by left-leaning ideologies, it's been a slow process over the course of decades. And you can go back and look at the origins of one of the clubs we exposed, the Students for a Democratic Society. One of their chapter at UVU has been causing a lot of problems. And but it's actually an organization that spans the entire country and goes back to the civil rights movement. And you can see that these left-leaning groups, organizations on campuses have been part of the picture since the 50s and 60s, although it was a different context back then. Today, the way that conservative voices are silenced on campus has been looked at by a lot of different people, and talked about for the last decade or more, but it's still common. And we have receipts that we haven't yet published that show students getting assignments from their professors that expect them to write or engage with a left-leaning worldview as if they weren't conservatives, as if there weren't any conservatives in the classroom. I think some left-leaning professors almost take it for granted that conservative values aren't common at the universities they work in. But at UVU, I can tell you for sure, many of the students feel like their conservative beliefs aren't welcome.
At UVU, yeah. So they're it really seems to me that they're intentionally stomping out conservative values. I know that I've reached out to a few candidates and they'll say, "Oh, we're not going to talk to you because you're conservative." And I'm so shocked, having moved here from Washington State, that that's what we're facing in the place that we sought refuge.
Yeah.
And I feel very passionate about this cause because I have a son who will be graduating in a week and a half from high school, and where he goes is still up in the air because I don't know where it's safe to send a kid. And speaking of safe, I want to talk about some of the things that you exposed. Bella Chow was written on, and that's the same thing. Did Tyler write that? Did Tyler have that on a bullet?
Yeah, it was written on one of the bullet casings.
I should say allegedly. Yes.
Yeah, correct. It was written on one of the bullet casings that we know for a fact. Allegedly, Tyler Robinson wrote those on the bullet casings.
And Bella Chow is an Antifa slogan.
Yeah, it originates. Sorry.
Go ahead. No, keep going.
It originates from Italy back in the 1940s, I believe, when there were anti-fascist partisans fighting against the fascist government in Italy, and it's a folk song that translates to "Goodbye, Beautiful," and it's got a catchy tune, and I would hear it from time to time before I knew it was its political implications, but it has come to be known in far left circles as a way to threaten conservatives. "Goodbye, Beautiful." It's a direct threat, and since it was written on the bullet casings allegedly used by Tyler Robinson, conservatives, especially at UVU, are a little bit sensitive to that. We have reports, and we didn't have the evidence that we thought was satisfactory to include it in our story. But we have heard reports that left-leaning students will play that song around TPUSA tables, which we think is highly inappropriate. If it happens again, we're hoping to get video evidence of it. But we know for sure that it's being written down and used in group chats and written down on sidewalks during protests.
Why is it being allowed?
This is a really good question. So this opens up a different can of worms about what UVU represents in Utah. And I don't think a lot of people know this, but UVU has tried to position itself over the last few years as a school where they encourage scholarship and discussion on depolarization. The outgoing president, Astrid Tumenez, launched an initiative that she called Better Selves for a Better America in the wake of Charlie Kirk's assassination. And she pulled levers that they had already at UVU with organizations they'd worked with in the past to bring in these depolarizing organizations, some of which, some of these organizations I think are very good, like Braver Angels, and other organizations that I think aren't. But they brought in organizations to try and help the student body and to help the university recover from Charlie Kirk's assassination. But what ended up happening was that they kind of squashed Charlie Kirk himself, and they squashed what his values were, and they tried to use his death as a way to rally around unity. So in the wake of his death, they had a vigil for unity instead of a vigil for Charlie Kirk. And I know that offended a lot of conservative students, including myself, who felt like Charlie Kirk's values in life weren't given the honor he deserved. And there's talk of a memorial where he was shot, and there are many calling for a memorial for unity rather than a memorial for Charlie Kirk. That's the kind of rhetoric that UVU has kind of tried to push out in the wake of the assassination that, hey, we just need to come together and be friends and be civil. But in doing so, a lot of conservative students have felt like um, it's not paying tribute to what Charlie stood for and what he fought for, and that it's trying to overshadow him. And we feel like a memorial for unity would be offensive. But
Right. Well, the thing is that do you unify with things that you fundamentally disagree with? And
yeah,
who's being asked to unify? I think that's really
yep,
important because it's always a you need to give in, you need to be better. We're already better, right?
yeah,
We're already the better group. I find it interesting that you
yeah.
said you like Braver Angels. Have you been to any of their
When I say I
meetings?
like them, I would say I respect them actually.
Okay.
So I actually just got done with a breakfast a few days ago with the CEO of Braver Angels.
Okay.
He's a man I respect, and I'm getting to know, and I'm going to be traveling out to their conference. But as an outspoken conservative and as one who is not willing to back down or compromise on some of my issues, I see Braver Angels as not a very useful ally in the culture war.
Mhm.
However, I appreciate what they're trying to do, and I don't think they're poorly motivated.
Okay.
Um, but for those people out there who might be expecting Brave Angels to pick a side in the culture war, I don't think they're going to do that. I think their work is elsewhere, which is why I think some people on both sides have been upset with Braver Angels in the past.
Well, I've been to 5 of their events, and I have found them to make caricatures of conservative voices to think that we all think the same, which I think is fundamentally I wouldn't say it's our
Yeah,
problem, but it definitely keeps us from moving
yeah,
further, because
and
we're
yeah,
so different. Go ahead, what you're gonna say?
yeah. That's actually why Mari Giles, the CEO of Braver Angels, reached out to me, and we had a great conversation because I had made those exact same comments towards Braver Angels on Twitter, and it got a lot of attention. And he sat down with me, and we talked about that. So I respect what they're trying to do. I have publicly acknowledged that they've made mistakes in trying to do that for sure.
Yeah.
But that goes back to UVU. I mean, UVU is making those mistakes, but on a much larger scale. But the problem and the difference between UVU and Braver Angels is that UVU doesn't feel sincere. Um, they don't
Okay.
feel as honest and open about it, and that makes conservatives like those at TPUSA feel like they don't have any hope of getting any of these issues that we exposed addressed. Which I
Right?
think was your original question. Why isn't anything being done? It's because there is a culture at UVU, from what I've seen, of tolerance, but selective tolerance. Um,
Mhm.
and it feels like the conservative right doesn't receive the same sort of grace and benefit of the doubt that is extended towards the left. And that's why we see that they're able to organize and do much more than the conservatives are on campus. Conservatives aren't able to get permissions for the same things. They're not able to get the same support from administration that these really radical left-wing clubs are able to do.
Have you heard of the term centering around the marginalized?
Yes, I've heard that term before, but tell me more.
So centering around the marginalized, and I'm going to pull up a picture here. So just a second while I make sure that we can be seen in the picture. There's tiny, we'll do it a bit better, maybe. Okay, so this is a wheel of privilege and power. Um, in the social justice kind of otherwise, for better word, woke ideology or progressive ideology, I think is a better way of putting it. It is just a simple given that this group, this way of thinking is correct. And this, what this does is it says that people in the center have the most power. And of course, that is the white, cisgender, Christian, heterosexual man who is gainfully employed.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So, because you are supposed to center around the marginalized, you can see in the top corner there, all of the marginalized are all of the other groups. And it is everything except for that white, cisgender, heterosexual, gainfully employed male.
Yeah.
And each group, let me make it a little bit bigger there. Hopefully, this will work. Okay. So each group there is a certain level of intersectionality, a certain level of privilege and power. Um, And so UVU seems to have just taken on that ideology. Just simply, we are right, and anybody who doesn't agree with us is wrong. Um, I've had situations. I've been in their struggle sessions. I don't know if you know what a struggle session is.
Yeah. Hmm.
Okay, so I've been in their struggle sessions where they want you to take on. They don't necessarily want you to take on guilt. What they were trying to do in this particular one was to talk about how the Mormon experience and the Black experience can be um, uh, intermingled with through intersectionality. That there was oppression, that Mormons were pushed out in a similar way to Blacks, that they were treated, as less desirable or whatever.
Hmm.
And it really does. I mean, I would say that it's a Marxist mindset that seems to be going at UVU. Would you agree with that?
Yeah. I definitely would. Now, this is where I would let my UVU colleagues speak more to this. But from
Okay.
the evidence I've seen, this is a widespread problem in academia, and it's a much bigger problem at UVU than it is, for instance, than at my school, at BYU.
Okay.
And the students are not just embracing it, but they're being what we're seeing is a generation of students who have been taught this Marxist mindset from the very beginning of their education, and have decided to fully embrace it, and to the point where they are willing to act violently towards those who think differently, which is what I got to in an article I published just a few hours after our report came out from the Cougar Chronicle. I published some commentary on it where I pointed out that these students are an embodiment of years of training. I wouldn't quite say brainwashing, but some might say that.
Hmm.
But years and years of being indoctrinated with this way of viewing the world has resulted in students that act like this, that almost acts like children.
Oh, infantilizing, absolutely.
Yep.
So what do you feel that is the difference between brainwashing and indoctrination?
I'm not sure exactly. I mean, that there's a semantic component to that, but I would say that we can't take away these students' accountability. They are still able to be held accountable for their actions, which is why I would say um, they're being taught, they're being misled, but ultimately they're still accountable. But at the same time, I think universities and parents should be held accountable as well for raising these students to the point where when they leave a university, and I point out in my piece that they're never going to enter a hall of learning again once they graduate, most often, right? Um, and by the time they left, they don't have the mindset or the skills to be productive citizens. They've only been taught to hate those who disagree with them,
Right.
to militate against those that disagree with them, and to see those that disagree with them as subhuman or undeserving of being fellow citizens. And that's a huge problem. We can't have a stable society when we have students leaving their final place of education with the belief that most of the people that disagree with them can't be coexisted with.
Um, Someone just said, "Shout out to BYU, my alma mater." So,
Awesome.
um, uh, sorry, I lost my train of thought there. Okay, I want to talk about where I think this comes from, and I'd love to get your thought on this. But I believe that what's happening is so many people are being taught to be victims, especially, and I know that this is something that you write about a lot. Um, Men don't have a way out. Let me White men do not have a way out. And I'm not a white apologist. I don't color matters like to me. so
Yeah.
but so what happens, I think, is that our men become weaker and weaker and weaker so that they're not told that they're toxic. And sometimes that becomes, I know that I've been in a thrift store where people will stand on the sidelines to guard a man while he puts on dresses and tell him how pretty and beautiful and stunning, and
Yeah.
they're making I think that they are causing the problem, and then they're coming up with a solution. And in a
I would agree with
university,
that.
that's yeah.
The
So,
incentives are very powerful here. I mean, if you are a um, socially awkward, lonely individual, and you see that you can get a lot of attention and make a lot of friends quickly, if you just accept certain beliefs, if you just accept these certain behaviors, then you'll be praised. Those incentives are stronger today than ever, in the direction of transgressing normal traditions and violating certain norms that usually keep society cohesive. Like you brought up, traditional gender norms
right.
are seen as something that need to be brought down. But what that really does is create an incentive to violate them so that you receive praise. Um, when there might not be as much of a pre-existing issue as some people think. So those incentives are powerful for students, who can get validation and approval from. It's a real huge problem when it's their professors that give them approval and
Right.
validation and even better grades and opportunities, if they just accept these leftist doctrines.
Well, and it's more than just accepting. I think it's also activating them, because we also saw this big push to normalize mental health.
Hmm.
Um, and not in a way that's like go out and run, plant a garden, but that
Yeah.
your issue, whatever it is, it should be normal, because the word I think I would use would be queer. And that does
Hmm.
not mean, as I've said many times, that does not mean anti lesbian, anti gay, or even anti gender confused. Queer means to twist reality. That's what
Hmm.
it means. And that's
Hmm.
what people are being taught to do at younger and younger ages. That wheel that I showed you, I saw it because it was supposed to come into our schools for 11th and 12th graders in order to graduate. They needed to memorize this wheel. They needed to
Wow.
understand. And what was crazy is it's brought in under the term ethnic studies, but underneath it, there's like 15 different genders that the kids are
Hmm.
supposed to know and accept as truth
Hmm.
before they ever get to school.
Yeah.
What happens? What year are you? Are you currently a student?
Yeah. I'm a senior at
Okay.
BYU.
Okay, you're a senior this year. Congratulations. What happens in how do these wholesome kids who've had their belief systems, how do they get onto campus and it just changes for them? How do they become these activists who are willing to dehumanize others to a very frightening level, in my opinion?
That's a really good question. So something I wrote about in my piece yesterday was something that Jonathan Haidt and Greg Lukianoff wrote in their book that a lot of people have probably heard of. It's called The Coddling of the American Mind. I
Mhm.
believe it came out in 2017 or 2018, but it's still very relevant today. In this book, they talk about three untruths. These are three false doctrines, false axioms that are being promulgated at our universities and among my generation in particular. The untruth of fragility. Children are being taught they're fragile, and what doesn't kill them makes them weaker. That things can break them. If someone disagrees with you and that offends you, that's bad. It's bad to be offended.
It's even
Um,
violence, right? Just
it's even violence.
triggers
Yep.
violence. Mhm.
Yes, that's where that's kind of that's how that extends into even rhetoric. The untruth of um, us versus them, that the world is divided into good and bad people. And if you believe certain things, you are good and other people are evil, as opposed to understanding the complexity of people and that not everyone is evil. Some people just have bad ideas. People can be wrong and disagree with you without being evil. And sometimes you're the one that's wrong. The untruth of good versus evil tells these kids, if you believe these things, you're the good guy and everyone else is the bad guy. And so there's a joke among conservatives sometimes, among my peers, that clubs like the ones we exposed at UVU, they call themselves like the Civil Disobedience Club, and really what they're doing is they think of themselves as an extension of Antifa, like anti-fascist. We have a joke where we refer to them as the anti bad guy good guy club, because that's how they think. They think they're the good guys against the bad guys. That's how they think.
Which is,
Whereas,
go ahead.
go ahead.
They're not learning nuance. So
Yeah.
it's crazy because they'll graduate and they really are taught to that they are empowered, that they are enlightened, that they are
Hmm.
better than other people, especially in Utah, where like I think it's 53% of the population does not have a college degree. And they'll be like,
Hmm.
I'm just better than you simply because I have this degree. And it's like, but you lost something in getting that degree that
Yep.
my third graders know. And that
Yep.
is, a dictator can
Hmm.
do good things. So
Yeah.
you have to find the humanity. And I think that they're being told not to anymore.
Yeah.
Um, Another
Exactly.
big thing that they're being taught is to ignore reason.
Hmm. Yep, that's untruth number 3. It's the
Okay.
untruth of emotional reasoning. It's not separating your emotion response from your reason. And students and are being taught that what feels right is right.
Right.
And that's a hard thing for conservatives to deal with sometimes. I made the point before that conservatism is really built on harsh truths, because conservatives conservatism in my mind is rooted in reality, and reality is harsh. And saying things like a man cannot become a woman, that doesn't feel good emotionally to say. And so you can't sell that lie emotionally, or you can't sell that emotionally. It's easier to sell the lie that men can become women because it can be emotionally gratifying to say that. And that's how I think a lot of the progressive movement fuels itself, is by selling lies rooted in emotional reasoning, and selling that feeling, like you said, of superiority, of virtue, that you are enlightened. It feels good to believe these things. It feels good to say that we need to liberate trans people. That it feels like you're fighting for a cause. And the conservative movement has a hard time pushing back against that, because we use harsh realities and we try to stay more in touch with reality, and that puts us at a disadvantage sometimes.
Right. It is true. You have to learn to use heart. And like I try very hard to be the brand of that mom next door, because
Hmm.
it's important that people feel that you care, but also that caring. I mean, if your child is about to touch a hot stove, you generally say, don't touch the hot stove. You even pick them up and move them if you have to, put a barrier
Yeah.
around them. And we're not doing that. And the only reason I can see that we're doing this is to intentionally manipulate these people and, quite frankly, to turn them into an army.
Yeah.
Would you say that's too extreme of a thought?
I would say they're openly using youth, to organize a political revolution, for sure.
Right.
And not to overthrow democracy or anything, but certainly to just obtain power. You see this in the UK, where they lowered the voting age, because they know that these youth they lack the maturity and the wisdom to be able to think reasonably and rationally. Sometimes they're more easily emotionally manipulated. And they've already been raised in this culture for so many years, where the left has been fairly dominant. So they know that if they let them vote earlier on, before they can really learn to think rationally and reasonably, that can help them obtain power, maintain power.
Yeah, the UK is what's going on there is insane. Not only are the kids voting early, but they're also being exposed to very graphic sexual materials very early. And
Yeah.
um, I do think that pleasure thing plays into what's going on here too, because it's always about instant gratification.
Yes.
If a group instantly praises you and says you're amazing, they love bomb you.
Yeah.
You'll do
Absolutely.
a lot for you'll do a lot for that positive affirmation.
Yeah.
And we've become that state. I mean, we literally were, I think, one of the only red states that had the whole affirmative model of
Yeah.
mental health care.
Yeah. And I think that's a problem. And I think there's so much more you could get into with that. But one thing that stood out to me when I was at the UN just a few months ago, just in March, and I was there with the pro-life movement at the UN's big feminist extravaganza that they do every year called CSW, the Commission on the Status of Women.
Mhm.
And I saw this. I saw as we sat in these panels surrounded by progressive people, they got such a reaction when they said little clickbaity things, little soundbitey things. There was such an emotional reaction in the room. When we went over to the more conservative side and we were listening to the panels there, it was more studious, logical, reasonable, and it was an interesting dynamic to see the difference between the emotional thinking. And I don't want to be unfair and say that's always all emotional thinking, but it's certainly more emotional thinking. And then go over to the conservative side and hear people talking about harsh truths about why marriage is important and why sacrifice is important and why people need to get married. And even though it's hard, it's important. And like people would be like, yeah, no, I think that's true. That makes sense. Rather than, yes, that feels good. It doesn't exactly feel good. It's telling kids that they need to prepare for marriage and be ready for that sacrifice and do that hard thing. It's not easy, and it's not easy to hear, but that doesn't mean it's not right. And I think that is an interesting highlight of the dynamic you're talking about.
Well, I think that's interesting because a lot of the people, I'll just be honest, when like if I go and get my nails done or go to the salon or whatever else, a lot of these young women are like, you're so lucky you get to stay at home. You're so, I mean, so it doesn't matter what you try to stamp out of these young people. There is an innate, but I want that. And what's wrong with wanting that?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So they have to
There's
go ahead.
I would recommend your listeners check out the Institute for Family Studies, as well as a few writers that you might have heard of, like Jonathan Haidt and Richard Reeves, and the last one is Mark Regnerus, and there are entire institutes of research trying to build this case of why what we've lost is the ability to do hard things on purpose, in pursuit of instant gratification, in pursuit of feeling good, in pursuit of our own ambitions. But that's leaving a whole generation unhappy in the long run, miserable, in fact, because they don't have families, they don't have meaningful relationships, and they look back at their lives of doing all the things they wanted to do in the moment and realizing that none of it really mattered in the long run. Whereas we can see in the research people who get their education and really stick it out, who work hard and pursue gainful employment, who get married and have children. In fact, the more children, the better in some cases. Those are the people the happiest at the end of their lives. And not surprisingly, I think, but maybe surprisingly to some, are the wealthiest. So they're the wealthiest financially, and I would say, spiritually or emotionally.
Like the most fulfilled.
Yeah.
So I have a theory and I'd love to hear your thoughts on it. And it will be a little bit controversial. I'll just tell you that before I
Sure.
start. Um, I think that African Americans, so this whole thing started in the 1920s. That is when the USSR came to America and started to infiltrate the Black churches and to change their biblical justice perspective to a social justice one. Before then, African Americans were starting to be upwardly mobile. As somebody who's
Yeah.
half African American, I had not heard the stories of successes growing up in our schools. I think that was intentional. Um, but what I see is this guinea pig practice. So the failures, the breaking down the family unit, the telling these people that they're victims and that the world, just constantly look back into the worst thing that's ever happened to your grandparents or your great
Mm-hmm.
grandparents, and hold on to that grievance. Now,
Mm-hmm.
but here's the reality is that when they hold on to this grievance, then the rest of society says, I don't want to be anything like them.
Yeah.
This, I'm blunt here, okay? So they say, I don't want to be anything like them. But then you take every practice that you did that was done to these people. And this is not me saying victimhood, Black power type. I'm saying that I can acknowledge that something was wrong, and I can want to right those wrongs. And I can say that instead of righting those wrongs, people are going, ding, 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 we figured this out. Now let's impose it on everyone else.
Yeah.
So we teach our kids through ethnic studies, through curriculums, through grievance, every grievance study, from feminist issues, gender issues, whatever the
Yes.
issue. We teach them, you are a victim, you should hold on to the grievance. And then what you make are dependent, infantilized, and angry people.
Yes. You put it very well. I think that's very accurate. Charlie Kirk was, uh, dragged through the mud by people after his death for saying similar things. They took him out of context. I wrote a whole piece about how Sharon McMahon completely took Charlie Kirk out of context, and that's why she should have not been the commencement speaker. And I'm glad she's not, although she's welcome to speak whenever she likes. But you're exactly right, and I think I really first learned this from Charlie Kirk, and then it's been reinforced to me by members of the African American community that if you look back at the community, the African American community in the 60s and 70s, what really defined that community at the time was family and hard work,
And faith.
um, and and faith, absolutely. And they were taking radical responsibility for their own success despite the challenges of the time. And then after the civil rights movement, they were told, you're not responsible for where you're at. The government's responsible. And all these programs and incentives were set up with possibly, good intentions. But what it ultimately ended up doing was incentivizing the destruction of the family and incentivizing the destruction of the faith and the unity of the Black community. And I think it's really sad to see that those same tactics that the government used, under Lyndon Johnson to
Mhm.
try to really help the Black community ended up really hurting them, are being used on our students today and are being used on women and on every marginalized group as if to perpetuate the victimhood mentality and to remove responsibility and accountability, which that's another one of the hard truths conservatives have to say. And we need to say it, that no matter what your circumstances are, no matter what injustices you faced, you are ultimately responsible for your destiny. And in America, you have a place where you can take control of your destiny, even if it's an uphill battle. Obviously, we should try to make sure there's an even playing field and make sure there isn't discrimination in the system. But bottom line is, even if there is, because the system will always be imperfect, you
Mhm.
have responsibility. And people who take radical responsibility for their lives tend to be happier and they tend to be more successful regardless of where they started. And I think people like Dr. Ben Carson are great examples of this.
There's actually a really great channel that you should look up. It's called The Mirror Reflecting the Left. And she's a former leftist administrator in colleges. She's very young, probably your age. And she she's looking at all of the things she's not supposed to look at. And then she starts having those discussions because it is extremely intentional. I'm not sure that Lyndon B. Johnson or any of these other people had the right had a good intention in the first place. I think that there's a lot of people who've wanted socialism because socialism means that the state is God. And I don't think many people understand that. Nobody teaches the end game.
Yeah,
It's a slow boil. So
I agree.
you said that you're in education. So I want to ask you about, or that you're, have you ever heard of social and emotional learning?
No.
Okay. So social and emotional learning is in most of our K-12 schools, but they want it in. So you've heard of the Dignity Index.
I have.
Okay. So this idea that, well, it's basically UVU's kind of policy of there is
Yes.
a certain level of good, and this is the way to be it. This is the way to achieve
Hmm.
it. And we're teaching that to people. And what I've seen with this quote, kind of good, I'm sure you've seen the more recent meme with the woman who is beating the Trump pinata,
Yes, I did see
right?
that.
And she has a shirt that says something
Hmm.
like,
Make America kind again. Yeah.
right? How do you guys deal with that when you're on campus? And like you said, BYU is different. but it's not completely. I mean, you
No.
have a certain group that I'm not going to mention here because I don't want their ire, but there are groups there that rub in their, their underprivilegedness as a privilege.
Definitely. Definitely.
How do you
You
feel with
definitely,
Go ahead.
yeah. Um, it's one of the main things that we discuss as young conservative students at BYU. Um, I think there is a lot of um, angst about what it means to have good relationships and be good to one another, especially at a religious university where our religious leaders have been teaching us to do that, and to prioritize being good to one another. And there are a lot of people who want to interpret that and say, okay, in order to do that, you have to have certain politics.
Mhm.
In order to be good to each other, you need to oppose ICE, and you need to oppose a war in Iran, or a war, or like kidnapping Venezuela's dictator and holding him accountable. You can't support actions like upholding law and order, or protecting America's interests if you want to be a nice person, because those are mean. And that really appeals to that emotional response that people have. And a lot of low information people who aren't really involved in politics can really quickly fall into that. And that's what we see a lot at BYU, is people saying those things, and then kind of moderate, not super politically involved people going along with it. And it bothers those of us that are trying to say we can be respectful to one another, and we can be good, upstanding Christians and good, upstanding Americans, while at the same time, advocating for upholding the rule of law and doing hard things, and doing things that might be uncomfortable but ultimately good for society. And there's a lot of tension about that at BYU. I would say, luckily, the people that agree with me and my colleagues, are in more positions of power these days, and I think the professors who believe similarly that we do feel less afraid to talk about it. And things are getting better, but there's certainly still an issue at BYU. And overall, in Utah, you see this not just at BYU, but throughout our culture here, because of the heavy religious influence, and people want to be good people. But we need to understand the nuance between good behavior and being good to one another, and treating each other with Christian respect, and politics and our policy ideas, because
Right.
those having a disagreement is not harmful. Believing that ICE should be able to deport illegal immigrants, that doesn't mean I'm a bad person, and that's not rude to say. And some people who use the dignity index, will often accuse conservatives of that very thing, which is a big problem.
Well, I think that empathy gets weaponized a lot in
Yep.
Utah. And I would go as far as to say it's tactical, it's intentional that it's used that way. And so a lot of people who say they want to be good people, I don't even think they can any longer define good,
Yeah.
because in moral relativism, there is no definition.
Yeah.
So, and I do
Yep.
feel that I feel that in Utah, that there's that uh honestly, I'd say there's kind of a bully culture, um
Yeah.
with with a drag performance of kindness on top of it. And I think that that's what happens when you're pushed into moral relativism, which, going back to that SEL, the dignity index would be the adult version of SEL. Um,
Yeah.
but
Yep.
just that moral relativism, I see a lot of signs that say be curious, not judgmental. No, there are times when we should be judgmental.
Yeah.
There are
Yep.
times when it's, you're introducing my kids to drugs. I was interviewing someone yesterday who, she said that the school is asking little kids to chant the names of their genitals.
That's weird.
It's weird, but
That's weird.
it's not supposed to be weird because you're supposed to be curious and not judgmental.
Is that happening here in Utah?
That's in California, but I would
Mm.
not be surprised. I mean, they're no longer calling it comprehensive sex ed. They're calling it puberty education for little
In
kids, like
Utah?
third graders. No, not
Oh,
yet.
okay.
But
Okay.
but I
You
always
gotta
say
tell me
not
when these things
yet.
happen in Utah.
Yeah. I'm
We'll
like,
we'll get on it.
I will absolutely tell you, and, I mean, there are people who definitely feel that we should have comprehensive sex ed in our schools now. So,
Yeah.
um,
Yeah, that was a
so
huge thing we saw at the UN was the way they use language. Comprehensive sex education, obviously, what that means is teaching gender theory to children.
right,
Um, we saw, obviously this has been around for a long time, but reproductive rights, reproductive health care for abortion.
right,
But at the UN, it's so common, and my wife and I wrote a whole article on our Substack about kind of a guide, a dictionary you need to have to know what they're talking about because
oh, I love that.
um, they really just hammer it into you. If you don't know what these words mean, you might think that they're talking about really good ideas when they're really not.
Safety, it's my favorite one. We are
Hmm.
constantly told to be safe. Well, to be safe means to self-censor. To be
Hmm.
safe means to never judge. To be safe means to make sure that your teacher at a
Hmm.
certain school in Mapleton,
Hmm.
feels comfortable being called Miss Sunshine, rather than Mr.
Mm,
Smith. Like, all of this is part of
yeah.
safety culture, and I
Yeah.
did make up the name. So,
Yeah.
but those things are, um, they're relevant, and they're here right now. I wanna
Yeah.
know, um, I wanna go back to the article. What were some of the more egregious things that you saw, um, while you were working on this in terms of what was exposed?
Yeah, that's a great question. And there really was so much, and there's actually more. So stay tuned because there will be more that we're putting out that expands on this. We just couldn't fit it all in one place. I think to me, one of the more egregious there's a few different things. There's obviously some of the group chats that were leaked from these official UVU club Discord servers. So it's their official means of communication within the club.
Yeah.
That reflects them talking about really violent rhetoric and really ideating on violence and mocking Charlie Kirk, and that's just disgusting and a little scary looking at. So there's that element. I think in terms of like the broad political strategy, one of the things that most alarms me is the Students for a Democratic Society. The national organization put out an Instagram post early in April that called for all the chapters of their organization at different campuses to kick Turning Point University or Turning Point USA off their university. And they gave instructions. They have like a QR code where you can download a document how to kick TPUSA off your campus, how to like get them in trouble, how to petition the administration, what to say, and it says things like smash their events, which is threatening and could obviously be misinterpreted by the wrong people. And we saw that at UVU, the local chapter of SDS took that, and within a week, they were targeting a fundraising event that the local Turning Point USA chapters were doing with a local restaurant and review bombing the restaurant, getting people to call the restaurant, showing up at the restaurant and protesting. I mean, there was you see that the way that these groups organize, they're well organized and well funded and coordinating across the entire country to do things like kick conservatives off campus, and that to me is just as alarming as some of the more violent rhetoric that you're seeing because you put those two things together and horrible things could happen.
Well, and I think we need to understand that these clubs are where our future politicians are coming from.
Yeah,
I oftentimes say that it's the drama kids running the Capitol.
yeah,
But
it is.
but these kids are, it starts earlier. A couple of years ago, somebody reached out to me and passed on what was going on in our schools with the GSA clubs and the Queer Youth Alliance, which was
Hmm.
teaching the kids how to be prepared to protest, to activate, and a lot of them, they are taught things like how to cancel someone.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
it's almost gamified because it's done in what's called a zine, right? And so a zine, it looks like a kid's magazine, like a cartoon magazine.
Hmm.
And so for them, it's gamified. They don't
Hmm.
see the real repercussions that I can imagine. I don't love the word empathy because I think it gets used all of the time, but I tend to be a rather empathetic person. And I just imagine what it would be like to go to school and have people just say, I hate that person. I hate that person. Like,
Yeah.
how did we get to a world where that's what you have to walk through school in when we're supposed to be truly better than that?
Yeah. You're supposed to demonstrate your virtue by being a terrible person to someone else in your community is, and that's really what we saw. These students believe they're doing the right thing. They believe they're being virtuous by writing Bella Ciao on the sidewalk or drawing pictures of ICE agents being shot, or they were standing next to ICE agents in their school while ICE was there for a career fair, and they
Right.
had signs with depictions of ICE agents shooting babies, and Nazi and calling ICE agents Nazis and secret police. I mean, these are law enforcement officers with families, and their job is to just enforce the law. And if you have any understanding of history, you know that there's no real comparison to any of the things that these students are
Oh,
saying.
there's a real comparison though, Kimball. The real comparison is that these kids act like the brown shirts.
Yes,
They
that
act
would.
like the color revolution, Mao's red guard.
Mhm.
Like,
Yes,
and they don't understand that that's what they're doing because they're not taught it in school.
yes. And as I said in my, I said in my piece, I last summer I traveled to Normandy, and I got to visit the beaches on Utah Beach, Omaha Beach, and there's the American Cemetery there. It's beautiful, and I recommend everyone go check it out. I didn't know at the time. I actually only found out recently. There's a German cemetery only 15 miles away, 15 kilometers away, that is pretty large. It holds 21,000 German soldiers who died during the Battle of Normandy, and it's there on French property. And it's got monuments there. It's got crosses to mark the graves. And I think it's astounding that the French, who were actually invaded by the Nazis, who were actually under their heel for 4 years, were
Mhm.
willing to give some of their land and build a monument to these soldiers who died, because they understood that some of these soldiers didn't really have a choice. They understood that the war was bigger than just good versus evil. They understood that, sometimes the dead deserve to be honored.
Right.
And even if they were bad people, sometimes their actions deserve to be remembered so we can learn from them. The French the French at that time must have had a lot of maturity and wisdom to allow that memorial to be built. And there's memorials like that all over France from World War I as well. I think that says a lot about what we've lost in the unread books in our unvisited libraries
Yeah.
that are just sitting in our campuses while students are sitting just outside those libraries calling ICE agents baby killers. I think that
Well,
says a lot of where we are.
I think that that's great. There's another part to that, and that is that a lot of the books are removed. So
Yeah.
a lot of the books that would teach the right kind of unity, because you don't unify with evil. You
Yeah.
can't. You can't unify with baby killers. You can't unify with people who think that removing parental rights is acceptable because
Yeah.
you're not affirming a confused 7-year-old. You know,
Yeah.
there's things that you cannot do. I want to ask you, did you know Charlie?
I didn't know him personally, no. But I started a chapter of TPUSA when I was in high school in 2017. So
Are you
I've been
here?
a long time. Sorry?
Are you from Utah?
Yeah, I started the chapter at Maple Mountain University, or sorry, Maple Mountain High School.
Okay. Okay. So you started it, but you'd never met him. Did you have opposition? Because out here, I'm not too far away from you, but out here, it took 2 years to get one started. And the only reason it did get started is because Charlie was killed. But for
I
2 years,
did
it got rejected. You did have opposition?
I did have opposition when I started it, yeah.
What was that like?
Um, I think the school was fairly accommodating in terms of allowing the chapter to exist. It was more about letting us do things. And it took a lot of negotiation with the school to be allowed to do certain things. They wouldn't let us do some of the things that TPUSA chapters generally did. Um, and some of it I understand, but I remember having a lot of being a lot of having a lot of angst at the time because I felt like I wasn't able to do anything with the chapter I just started. We eventually had to, pull a nuclear option, and I actually went straight to the office of Congressman John Curtis, who's now our senator, and I invited him to come to our school, and then I went and told the school, and they were like, "All right." so we had to do things like that in order to get things to happen, but there's been opposition every time I've started speaking out about my conservative values from all sides, and most frustratingly, the people I'm sometimes I get the most upset with are the moderates, the low information moderates who seem to be buying into the lies that are being told to them.
Yeah, that's a hard one. There's a ethical government group that I'd like to believe that some of them believe that they're doing the right thing, but the amount of damage that they're causing, I think that they're
Yeah.
emasculating men left and
Yes.
right. Um,
Yes.
and I mean, I could talk to you for so much longer about that subject, just because
Yes.
I hear these young boys. Um, well, I watch these young boys being told that to do boy things is toxic. And then I
Mm-hmm.
watch these men in Utah, and I mean, I'm from Seattle. I'm from the theater world. So my gaydar is real.
Yeah.
And I just sit there going,
Yeah.
because so what's going on there? What is going on with our governance? Because I feel like this is where the moderate takeover is causing real damage.
This is a huge topic. The organization you're talking about has been on our radar at the Kruger Chronicle for a long time. Um, I am hoping I get the opportunity to interact with some of them and confront some of them about these things in a cordial way, but in a way that I'm not going to back down, because I'm hoping to really ask them what's going on, because they are there are some ways I think they're being very dishonest, and some ways I think they're manipulating the teachings of religious leaders
Yes.
towards a political agenda, and that does not sit well with me. That is
Yeah.
something that I think is incredibly damaging. But I think there's a lot of low information people in Utah who are being taken in by it. I think Utah's a special place with a special people. And even if you're not a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, we welcome you into this culture where we want to be a little different than the world. And I think Utahns in general, whether you're a religious member of the church or not, want to feel different from the world. And I think there are groups who are taking advantage of that by saying, "Hey, you can be different. You can kind of be conservative, but also think that these progressive principles need to be taught in schools,
Mhm.
or that certain leaders of one particular party are really evil because they say mean things." And
Mhm.
I have a lot of family members who are very conservative, but are extremely put off by Donald Trump because uh, he has always been a firebrand. And then these groups, these kind of, I see them as a little bit dishonest, swoop in and say, "Hey, you don't like Donald Trump? Well, maybe you're not actually a conservative. Maybe you want to be a good person and be a liberal,
Right.
And that's frustrating, because I don't think that's my family who are conservative but don't like Trump. They're very conservative, and they'll all say, Trump's doing things I agree with, but I just really can't get over this one thing he said in 2016. And while I
Right.
think that's silly, they're entitled to think that, and they're being that feeling they have is being weaponized by people. And a good example of this is Sharon McMahon, who on
Right.
her website claims to be nonpartisan, but is clearly not. She calls anyone who supports the SAVE Act, which would create, voter ID nationwide. She calls anyone who supports that a white supremacist.
I mean,
She blocked me on Instagram when I criticized her in an article, and I didn't even interact with her page on Instagram. They truly do weaponize ignorance, and I have a big problem with that. And I think Utahns are particularly susceptible to that because they are very religious and want to be, Christian and
they
do the
want
right
to see
thing.
the good. They
They
want to
do.
they wanna give people the benefit of the doubt and to see the
Yes.
good, and it's very hard for them. I
Yes.
oftentimes say it's like Sleeping Beauty where everybody is asleep, and unfortunately, some
Hmm.
of these people are the fairies put in the spell on them
Yeah.
and telling them, "There's nothing to see here." But
Yeah.
my friends, there
Totally.
there's seriously something to see here. Man,
Totally.
I the last